Should I stay with the company or take up the attractive female CEO's offer? Faced with this difficult choice, I thought it over for about a week and made my decision. The answer was the resignation letter I just handed to the department head in the reception room. What? You're quitting? Don't be ridiculous. Why on earth are you saying this out of the blue? He yells. I steel myself and reply with a smile. As you always say, sir, I'm useless. I figured I shouldn't be holding everyone back. My decision to quit was unwavering. Things should have been going great at the new company with good relationships and all, but, oh no, the presentation data is gone. My name is Bob, 32 years old. Since graduating college, I've been working at Smith & Company in my hometown. The company is not huge compared to those in the big city, but it's well known around here. We do business with famous big corporations and even some overseas companies. That's why, despite being a small business, we have some pretty tricky work. Even a small mistake could cause major damage to the company, so we're all working hard in a somewhat tense atmosphere. To be honest, there's a lot of work where I'm held accountable, which can be nerve-wracking, but the pay is so good I cannot complain. Though, I laugh to myself, thinking how I'm earning all this money just to support my lonely bachelor life. While I've been living this work-centered life, even though I'm satisfied with the pay, I couldn't say my life was fulfilling. The reason for that? Hey Bob, what's this? Today, again, as usual, the department head, Mr. Johnson's yelling echoes through the office. Wondering what it is this time, I casually reply, it's coffee, sir. Mr. Johnson is pointing at the coffee I made. That was a cup of coffee he had squeezed me into making for him, though I declined to prioritize my daily tasks, and now it has pushed his anger button. Geez, what is he upset about today? Hearing my matter-of-fact answer, Mr. Johnson gets even angrier and shouts, are you stupid? I know that. I'm thinking he should just spit it out like a grown-up, but since he's the boss, I play it safe and ask, is something not to your liking, sir? Mr. Johnson then says with a disgruntled look, I told you to put sugar in my coffee. How am I supposed to drink this bitter stuff? And shoves the coffee cup towards me. But I am definitely sure I put one sugar stick in his coffee, while murmuring to myself about his self-centered attitude. Forcing someone to prepare coffee was annoying enough, but still he was complaining about the sugar. With all due respect, sir, I did put sugar in it. Then the boss grumpily asks, how many packets? I answer honestly, 1, sir. I have a sweet tooth. I need at least 3. How long have you been working here? Can't you even remember your boss's preferences? Unbelievable. In my mind, I'm thinking, how the heck am I supposed to know that? Even at cafes, they usually give you just 1 sugar packet. If you want more, you have to say so. But I don't show these thoughts and reluctantly apologize. I'm sorry, I'll bring you some more sugar right away. As I grudgingly get up to head to the break room, Mr. Johnson adds insult to injury by complaining, this is why useless people are such a pain. How much trouble are you going to cause? Yeah, days like this are not rare. They're more like business as usual. Mr. Johnson has labeled me useless and throws abuse at me for any little thing. He also insists he said things he never did, or tells me about schedule changes at the last minute, saying, this just changed, so it might be hard to deal with. At worst, he dumps work on me right before the deadline. Thanks to that, my overtime hours keep piling up every month. Yet for some reason, Mr. Johnson often takes me along to his meetings. I feel a bit frustrated, thinking I'm just a chauffeur, a valet, or maybe a minutes keeper. But I try to secretly learn his negotiation skills while I'm at it. Someone who couldn't handle the job might have run away long ago, but since Mr. Johnson is actually good at his work, I've somehow been putting up with the situation, grumbling all the while. Because Mr. Johnson treats me like this, I feel like my colleagues, both senior and junior, are avoiding me, probably thinking, I don't want to get involved, or I don't want to be targeted. For these reasons, even though I'm satisfied with the pay, I can't say my life is fulfilling at all. Now that I'm in my early 30s, I've started to vaguely think, maybe there are more important things than money. Then a few days later, as usual, I was preparing to attend Mr. Johnson's meeting. My job was still being a chauffeur, valet, and taking a meeting minutes for the day. To prepare the minutes, I had a rough understanding of the project details. This was because last week, Mr. Johnson said, "You'll be coming with me to my meeting next Tuesday," and handed me a thick stack of documents. When it's a project I'm in charge of, he always gives me the materials at the last minute, but for his own projects, he informs me in advance like this. I really wish he'd always do it this way, I think, as I checked the contents of the documents. As expected of the department head's work, it's a rather complex project. Although I was used to being dragged along for Mr. Johnson's work, this time, since there weren't many people in the office, I decided to take a chance and ask in a low voice, "Mr. Johnson, why do you take me, someone you call useless, to your meetings?" Perhaps surprised that his usually silent subordinate suddenly asked a question, Mr. Johnson looked dumbfounded for a moment, but then quickly started grinning. "Huh? I can still make use of a useless dude to carry luggage and drive. It's much better than leaving him in the office, isn't it?" he said, patting my shoulder. I forced a smile and said, "I see," before leaving my seat. Walking down the hallway, I had been harboring a faint hope that he might say something like he was giving me a chance to learn, but I resigned myself to the fact that, for better or worse, Mr. Johnson's reasoning for using a useless person like me was somewhat logical. Still, I was confident that I had developed relatively high skills compared to my peers, having observed and learned from many department head-level tasks. That's why being spoken to like that stung a little. Then, on the day of the meeting, I carried all the luggage and informed the receptionist that we had a meeting appointment. After the appointment was verified, we were shown to the reception room. After waiting for a few minutes, with a knock, "Sorry for being late," and our counterparts appeared. The ones who entered were a woman so beautiful it took my breath away, and a foreign man who seemed to be her subordinate. The beautiful woman introduced herself. "I'm Miller, CEO of Banotech Corporation." She looked much younger than the image of a CEO I had in mind, appearing to be about the same age as me. After Mr. Johnson greeted her, I introduced myself. "I'm Bob, also from Smith & Company." For a split second, Miller's eyes seemed to widen as if surprised, saying, "Oh, was it just my imagination?" I wondered, while turning my attention to the foreign man who was introducing himself next. The man, named Joseph, was from the South America. He was struggling to greet us in English. Once the introductions were over, Mr. Johnson took charge and immediately began a presentation. As the luggage-carrying driver, I wasn't involved in the explanation at all. Mr. Johnson did all the talking while I just sat there. Miller nodded along to Mr. Johnson's explanation, saying "uh-huh," but Joseph looked confused. Joseph whispered to Miller, "Mrs. Miller, I don't understand this part," pointing at the document. Miller hurriedly looked at Mr. Johnson and me, saying, "I'm sorry. He just came from Brazil. He can handle everyday conversations in English, but when it comes to difficult topics, there's a lot he doesn't understand." Mr. Johnson replied with a polite, "I see. Well, I think his English is very good." I also smiled and said, "I agree. I think it's very good too." Miller said, "I'm so sorry for taking up your time," and started trying desperately to explain the meaning to Joseph in what seemed to be unfamiliar English. However, Joseph's questions seemed endless, and Miller was looking quite troubled. Mr. Johnson also seemed a bit irritated at having his talk interrupted. So I suggested, "If you'd like, I can explain it." Mr. Johnson reacted to my words, glaring at me as if to say, "You, for speaking out of turn." Contrary to that, Miller's face brightened up and she said, "Really?" Looking pleased. I addressed Joseph. "I speak Spanish, so please don't hesitate to ask in Spanish." Joseph exclaimed "Gracias," happily, and then started speaking fluently in native Spanish. I responded to Joseph in the same level of Spanish. Eventually, Joseph's questions were resolved, and his understanding of the project deepened. He thanked me gratefully. He explained, "I'm attending this meeting to study business English communication, but it was still a bit difficult," and laughed. As a result, Joseph apologized for interrupting the meeting, but I reassured him, "There's no need to apologize. It's wonderful that you're so eager to learn." As the meeting settled down, I looked at Mr. Johnson and could see his eyes darting around. Oops, Mr. Johnson seemed confused. I would get chewed out by him on the way back to the office, I thought. While I was thinking this, the business talk ended, and the meeting was adjourned. At the parking lot, I put the luggage in the back seat and closed the door. Mr. Johnson has already gotten into the passenger seat, sitting there looking all high and mighty. I wonder what he's going to say to me on the way back. As I'm feeling anxious about this, Ms. Miller comes running over. I hastily ask, "Ms. Miller, what's the matter? Why are you in such a hurry?" She takes my hand, saying, "Bob, here you go," and passes me a memo paper. Suddenly, having my hand held by a beautiful woman, I freeze up and my mind goes blank. Ignoring my condition, she whispered, "This is my personal contact information. I'm only giving it to you, Bob. I'm expecting your call, but keep it a secret, okay?" She smiled, waved, and left. Coming back to my senses, I secretly look at the memo paper and see what appears to be a mobile phone number written on it. With my heart pounding, I tuck the paper into my inside pocket and get into the driver's seat. Ms. Miller, wasn't it? What did she want? Mr. Johnson asks grumpily, and I panic, quickly lying. It seems I left my pen in the meeting room earlier, and she brought it to me. Johnson sneers, "What's that about?" As expected of a useless person like you. Relieved that my lie wasn't discovered, I start the car. On the way back, although I was nervous about what he might say, Mr. Johnson dozed off, and I was left with my heart racing over the memo paper. In a way, nothing happened, and we made it back. Over the weekend, despite my nervousness, I decided to call the number I received. Ms. Miller answers the phone. "Hello, this is Miller." Nervously, I stammered, "This is Bob from Smith & Co. I met you at the meeting the other day." Miss Miller replied in her delighted voice, "Oh, I'm so glad you called." When I ask about her purpose, she says she wants to meet personally. That beautiful woman wants to meet one-on-one personally. Although I think I'll be incredibly nervous, of course I agree, and we make plans to have dinner at a restaurant in the city 2 days later. On the day of my appointment with Ms. Miller, I nervously go to the restaurant and meet up with Ms. Miller. The luxurious decorations inside the restaurant further emphasize her beauty. Sitting across from each other, we enjoy the course meal while making small talk like how's work, and what kind of work do you usually do? Afterwards, she puts on a serious face and says, "I apologize for the long preamble, but the reason I asked you here today, Bob, is because there's something I really wanted to talk to you about." The atmosphere changes drastically from relaxed to serious, and my nervousness peaks. Miller takes a small deep breath and says, "I'll get straight to the point. Bob, I want you to join my company, Banotech Corporation." Confused by the sudden invitation, I'm at a loss for words. Miller continues, "Bob, you're actually much more capable than Mr. Johnson, aren't you?" According to Miller, from what she's heard, my treatment at Smith & Company could be considered unfair. She said she came to believe that I'm very dependable, considering the fact that I understood complex projects deeply and satisfactorily explained them in detail to Joseph in Spanish. Inwardly, I regretted, "Oh no, I must have unconsciously complained about my company during our small talk earlier." To cover up my slip of the tongue, I continued, "No, that's not true." However, Miss Miller gave me a stern look and said, "That's not good. It's a shame for the Bob of the past who worked so hard to get into a very difficult university." The me of the past, I mutter involuntarily, while wondering why Miss Miller knows about my past. Her words struck deep inside me, fulling emotions I had kept frozen. It's true that I graduated from a university considered prestigious, not just at the state level but worldwide. None other than the famous Harvard University. From kindergarten, I was full of curiosity, and before I knew it, I was studying of my own volition. My parents supported me by sending me to one of the exclusive schools up through high school. I prioritized studying over socializing, always giving in to my never-fading curiosity. I set Harvard University as my goal and successfully got in. Everything I learned at university was new and exciting, but it seems that life in Northern California suited me better. So after graduation, I returned to my hometown and got a job at Smith & Co. Somehow, Ms. Miller seemed to know all this. While I'm puzzled, now is not the time to ask how do you know this. Her words were a wake-up call for me. I realized that the current job isn't challenging for me, and actually having a feeling of why am I living a life where I'm treated as useless under such a boss. It's not just about Joseph. At Banotech Corporation, We're currently looking to increase our business opportunities abroad. That's why we need someone like you, Bob, with excellent Spanish skills. I can say I'm very good at it myself. Of course, I'm studying, but still. I've been called useless countless times and avoided by my colleagues at work. Now suddenly being told I'm needed, I'm confused. Please let me think about it for a while, I reply, and we end our meeting for the day. Should I stay with Smith & Company or take up Ms. Miller's offer? Faced with this difficult choice, I thought it over for about a week and made up my mind. The answer was the resignation letter I just handed to Mr. Johnson in the reception room. Perhaps because it was so sudden, Mr. Johnson's face contorts as he yells, "What? You're quitting?" I calmly reply, "Yes. Thank you for everything up until now." But Mr. Johnson shouts emotionally, "Don't be ridiculous. Why are you saying this all of a sudden?" I steel myself and respond with a smile. "As you always say, sir, I'm useless. I figured I shouldn't be holding everyone back anymore." Still, Mr. Johnson tries to stop me, saying things like, "What about the hole you'll leave? And there's no way a useless person like you could get hired elsewhere." Curious about this contradictory behavior, I ask, "Why are you trying to stop someone useless from leaving?" He replies with an answer that doesn't seem heartfelt. "I'm saying this for your own good." Exasperated, I retort, "Your sentiment alone is enough, thank you." Perhaps irritated, Mr. Johnson resorts to nonsensical taunting. "Are you running away? Fine then, running away means you lose, you know. You can interpret it however you like. As for me, I'm escaping from under your thumb. If anything, I'd call that I fire back, as if venting all my pent-up frustrations. The argument continued for a while, but other employees, probably sensing the tension, intervened. Finally, Mr. Johnson left the room, hurling one last insult. "Do whatever you want, dumbass." In the end, my resignation was officially accepted. I handed over my duties and left Smith & Company with a refreshed feeling. Afterwards, I transferred to Banotech Corporation. Here, no one calls me useless. The senior employees are kind, and even the younger staff, who are my juniors in terms of work experience, look up to me because of my experience at Smith & Co. While the salary at Smith & Company was slightly higher, Banotech Corporation pays me enough to live comfortably. With the change in my surroundings making life easier, I was more than satisfied with just that. I also became friends with Joseph, whom I met at the meeting. We started teaching each other. I teach him English, and he, in turn, gives me Portuguese lessons. At Banotech Corporation, I found the daily fulfillment that was never available at Smith & Co. Several months passed, and I became completely accustomed to working at Banotech Corporation. Although I struggled at first with the different ways of doing things compared to Smith & Company, with the support of my kind seniors, I became able to handle my work normally. One day, I was personally asked by Ms. Miller to help with a job. Unlike with Mr. Johnson, this wasn't just being an errand boy, but a proper request as part of the job. Apparently, it was a big project with a company in Rio de Janeiro, and Ms. Miller wanted me and Joseph to go with her at the end of next month. As Miller was my benefactor, I gladly accepted no matter how difficult the task, and the three of us proceeded with creating materials and practicing Portuguese presentations. I compiled the data, Ms. Miller reviewed it, and Joseph, a native speaker, and I checked the correctness of the Portuguese translation. We had a perfect system of the three of us working together. The day before heading to Rio de Janeiro, as we were preparing for tomorrow, Joseph, looking at his computer, said, Doesn't this seem strange to you both? When we checked, the presentation materials that should have been saved on the server were gone. Miller hurriedly said, "What about the backup server?" But when Joseph checked, they weren't there either. Strange. They were definitely there until yesterday. Miller starts to panic, saying, Why? Joseph is also getting upset, saying, "Who would do such a thing?" I had to intervene in a stern tone. "Calm down. This is no time to panic or get upset." With those words, they both calmed down, saying, "You're right, Bob, and I'm sorry." Taking a deep breath, I calculate the time we have left. It's now 5 p.m. We have 14 hours until we board the plane, and the flight from California to Rio de Janeiro takes about 15 hours. We don't have to start work immediately upon arriving in Brazil. So we have over 30 hours until the meeting. Even if we leisurely sleep for 6 hours within that time, we still have 24 hours. For now, Ms. Miller and Joseph, please continue with the usual preparations. I'll make sure the materials are ready in time. At this moment, I felt motivation welling up from the bottom of my heart. It was a feeling that had always welled up when I first joined Smith & Company, but had been lost while being treated as useless by Mr. Johnson. Now, in this crisis, it had come back to life. I decided, it's been a while, but I'm going to give it my all. Fortunately, the raw materials for the documents were also saved on my laptop. While feeling regretful that we should have backed up offline as well, I recreated the documents as best as I could remember. I continued working at the hotel room we had booked near the airport. Before I knew it, it was past 5 a.m. By this time, about 50% of the documents had been restored. I quickly took a shower and had breakfast, then left the hotel to make sure I wouldn't be late meeting the other two. When we met up, they were worried about how sleepy I looked, but there was no time left. I couldn't sleep until it was finished, so I desperately continued creating the documents. During the flight, I worked in airplane mode, and the other two helped me. Thanks to that, our pace increased, and we managed to complete the work with about 5 hours left until Brazil. All that was left was to integrate Miller's and Joseph's parts with mine after we got off the plane. For a rush job, it turned out well, perhaps even better than before we had to remake it. Relieved that we had somehow finished, I apparently slept like the dead until we arrived. As a result of our desperate restoration work, the presentation was a huge success. While we couldn't secure the job immediately, we could see the light for a potential deal worth over $20 million. After returning to the States and things settled down, Ms. Miller began investigating the disappearance of the documents. Her first suspicion was accidental deletion, but those documents were in a folder accessed through several other folders, so it was unlikely they were accidentally deleted by chance. While Ms. Miller was reluctant to suspect her important employees, saying, "I can't believe I'm doubting my staff," I managed to persuade her. We still need to investigate. It's to prove the innocence of the employees. Also, if it was an attack from outside, we need to respond quickly. Though hesitant, Ms. Miller agreed and began checking the logs as a last resort. As a result, we were able to find traces of the file being deleted in the operation records. However, the person who did it turned out to be none other than Mr. Brown, one of Banotech Corporation's executives. Miss Miller couldn't hide her disbelief, saying no way. But after a while, as if she had made up her mind, she called Mr. Brown in. When confronted with the evidence, Mr. Brown immediately confessed, crying bitterly, "I did it." When asked for his motive, it turned out it was presented as a condition for headhunting. "I see. Who recruited you?" Miss Miller asked in an intimidating voice, but with a hint of trembling. Mr. Brown hesitated, but unable to bear the silence, he confessed, "It was Mr. Johnson from Smith & Company. I was listening in the CEO's office and forgot to breathe, feeling as if time had stopped." Apparently, Mr. Brown had been personally contacted by Mr. Johnson. He promised to negotiate with the CEO of Smith & Company for Mr. Brown's recruitment and a higher salary than Banotech Corporation. Conveniently, an executive at Smith & Company was about to resign due to health reason, and Mr. Brown, as an executive at Banotech Corporation, was deemed sufficient to fill that gap. Attracted by this headhunting offer, Mr. Brown accepted Mr. Johnson's condition to ruin the biggest job Bob is in charge of. While Mr. Brown continued to apologize, saying he now regretted his actions, what he did was unforgivable. To maintain the order of Banotech Corporation as an organization, Ms. Miller made the decision to dismiss Mr. Brown. She accused him severely of wrongdoing and officially informed him that she would take legal action to prevent this from happening again. The incident with Mr. Brown was also reported to Smith & Co. We also strongly condemned Mr. Johnson and demanded a detailed investigation and report about him. As a result, it was revealed that Mr. Johnson had acted on his own from a selfish motive. That motive was harassment of Bob. At Smith & Company, only the HR department and executives knew that I was a Harvard graduate. I didn't want to be praised just for being a Harvard graduate, so when I joined a company, I had directly negotiated with the CEO to keep it hidden. But somehow, Mr. Johnson had found out that I graduated from Harvard, while Mr. Johnson graduated from a top university. He felt frustrated knowing he had a subordinate with higher academic credentials. For this reason, taking advantage of the fact that I was hiding my academic background, he ridiculed me as useless. In other words, all that harassment stemmed from jealousy. The reason he brought me along to meetings was that he intended to have me support him if he ran into any trouble. Apparently, deep down, Mr. Johnson thought Bob is capable. However, regardless of the circumstances, Mr. Johnson's actions, like Mr. Brown's, were unforgivable. Miller decided to take legal action against him as well. She also announced that there would be penalties in dealings with Smith & Company for a while. Perhaps regretting the incident with Mr. Johnson, Smith & Company accepted these penalties. Several years later, I ended up marrying a certain woman. Her name was Catherine Miller, the CEO and my boss. After that incident, we worked on numerous projects together, and as we overcame hardships and joys together, we were drawn to each other. Since we would be living together, Catherine boldly purchased a luxury high-rise apartment. Moving from an apartment to a luxury high-rise, I was nothing but nervous about the drastic change. While preparing for the move, I discovered something familiar among Catherine's belongings. "Catherine, can I look at this?" "Sure." It was a high school graduation album, and the high school name and graduation year were the same as mine. Thinking it couldn't be, I opened it, and although we were in different classes, there was Catherine's name and photo in the same year as me. Looking alternately between the photo and Catherine's face, I was certain it was her. Then Catherine smiled and said, "Don't tell me you just realized," followed by, "Aren't you a bit slow?" as she laughed in earnest. It was here that I finally understood why Catherine seemed to know about my past back then. "You know, Bob, in high school, you seemed completely uninterested in people, always studying. Well, I guess that's undoubtedly why you got into Harvard." Catherine said she had secretly admired me, who was always among the top performers. I apologized to her, saying sorry, I really just noticed, while also self-deprecatingly thinking how incredibly slow I was. A year after our marriage, a daughter was born to Catherine and me. Our daughter, whom we named Sarah, grew up in the blink of an eye. We vowed to continue our efforts so as not to disappoint our daughter and so that she could be proud of her parents in the future.